Hello, boys and girls. Today we are going to talk about ideology. First through Borges's Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, and then through Haslanger's ideology in practice. Borges first. So the story is complicated, but the heart of it is an attempt to describe the society of Tlön, where everyone shares a certain what to us might seem like a very strange metaphysical belief. And this metaphysical belief is idealism. Idealism has a special meaning in philosophy. In philosophy, it means something like the belief that the world is a product of the mind. Maybe my mind, maybe our minds, maybe the mind of God, but somehow it is a product of the mind. Okay. And the story attempts to imagine what a society would look like if everybody in that society shared this belief in idealism. So there are sort of counterparts to all of the institutions and practices that make up, like the typical human society. So things like literature or storytelling, things like philosophy, things like science, things like history, and so on. Language, okay. And Borges attempts to imagine, what would these practices look like in an idealist society. So he imagines that the language would stick to describing sort of the surface appearances of things, how things are experienced by people. It wouldn't rely too heavily on nouns, which refer to the underlying substances, that is, the things that sort of are underneath or which cause our experiences. Because remember, idealists think that there is nothing outside of our minds, and therefore, at least to some extent, nothing outside of experiences or the sorts of things you could experience or the sorts of things you could think about. Okay. The only science they have is psychology, because psychology is the study of the mind, and they think that all things are ultimately mental. Their version of metaphysics, which in our world is devoted to understanding the difference between appearance and reality and how things are really deep down in spite of how they may seem. Well, if you think that there is no reality independent of how things appear in our own minds or how things are produced by our own minds in any case, there's not going to be a difference between appearance and reality. And so for them, metaphysics is this sort of totally fictional creative enterprise. Okay. These are just some examples of ways in which Tlön society differs from our own. I think you can sort of appreciate this or enjoy this, if you go in for that sort of thing, as a kind of masterful description of a society that is extremely strange to us. But I think the Borges story at least makes some suggestions about inferences we might make or ideas we might explore in describing, our own world. One idea that I think you can get out of the Borges story is that people will go to extraordinary lengths to defend and insulate from criticism certain core beliefs. So if you think that idealism really is just a completely bonkers view, that it's just obviously false, well, this is a story about how a group of people will get together and organize their lives, organize their thinking, organize their society to insulate themselves from criticism of this core belief. So we might ask, how do we do that in our own lives? Can you think of an example? It's hard to identify examples from your own set of beliefs because they tend to be sort of invisible. But if you think hard enough, or if you're being honest with yourself, can you think of any examples of beliefs that you have insulated against criticism in this way, that you have built your life around protecting? I don't know. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. It's worth asking whether there are any such beliefs, and if there are, what they are. Okay. I think another suggestion that Borges' story makes that we might pursue is that, well, if the people of Tlön have organized their society around this metaphysical belief, well, that suggests that, other societies might be organized around metaphysical beliefs. It's hard to say exactly what those metaphysical beliefs might be, living in New York City in 2021, right? Because, this is a very diverse society. We have very different beliefs. It's hard to think of anything in particular, let alone a sort of really substantive metaphysical claim like idealism that we all agree about. Nevertheless, I think there are some possible examples of, either in our own society or in societies from other times and places, of metaphysical beliefs that have supported or justified sort of basic features of the organization of the society and the organization of individual people's lives. So maybe, for example, the belief that human beings are fundamentally different from other animals because we have souls or because we were made in the image of God. This is a metaphysical belief because it's a belief about what makes us human. It's about what makes things what they are. That's one type of metaphysical belief. And this metaphysical belief is used to justify some basic features of our way of life. For example, our treatment of non-human animals. If you think that you're made in the image of God, but cows and pigs and chickens aren't, then maybe that justifies eating their bodies. Okay. Maybe metaphysical belief in life after death, either through reincarnation or through going to heaven, will get people to sort of acquiesce to or be okay with features of their lives that they wouldn't otherwise be okay with. So if you think that there's life after death and your life on earth sucks, maybe you're going to be okay with that. Maybe the belief in life after death or belief in reincarnation will justify injustice or human misery. Okay. Maybe today, for example, it's very popular for people to believe that there's no fact of the matter when it comes to moral or aesthetic judgment. So nothing is objectively right or wrong. Maybe things are only right or wrong or beautiful or ugly or dainty or elegant or whatever. Maybe things are only right or wrong, moral, or beautiful, ugly, dainty, or elegant, aesthetic, relative to a point of view. Or maybe you think that moral judgments are just expressions of our feelings or emotions or tastes or preferences. They're not really beliefs about the world at all. Anyway, these are, at least in part, metaphysical beliefs. They're beliefs about how the moral and the aesthetic sort of fit into the physical. Maybe they're just sort of projections of our minds in some sense. Okay. And you could imagine some sorts of practices which might be justified through these metaphysical beliefs. For example, maybe if you're as philosophers might say, an aesthetic anti-realist, you don't think that there are mind-independent facts about what is, for example, beautiful or ugly. Maybe you'll just be more tolerant, right, of other people's aesthetic tastes and preferences. You won't, pick fights with people about what is beautiful or ugly. Whereas if you were an aesthetic realist, if you thought that there were mind-independent or objective facts about what is beautiful or ugly, you'd be more willing to sort of take public stands or disagree with people about aesthetic matters. That's possible. So those are some possible examples of metaphysical beliefs which might be used to justify social practices or ways of life. Okay. So far, we've been thinking about ideology in terms of beliefs, what people believe. So we've been looking for primarily examples of people's ways of life or social practices or institutions being shaped by their beliefs about metaphysics, their beliefs about what makes things what they are, the fundamental structure of reality, what sorts of things exist. Okay. But there's another sort of tradition in thinking about ideology, which is represented in the readings by Haslanger. So Haslanger offers what she calls a practice-first approach to ideology. This can be a little confusing. I mean, all of this stuff can be confusing, but this can be a little confusing in part because often we just mean, by ideology, we just mean the stuff you believe. But Haslanger is using ideology in a different sense. She's using ideology for a particular theoretical purpose. Okay, so she says, I'm looking for a concept that can do two jobs. On the one hand, the first job is that it can explain how people have, as she says, a shared practical consciousness, which is something like a shared way of doing things, a shared way of life, a shared orientation to how things are supposed to get done, or something like that. Okay. On the other hand, part two, she's looking for a concept that can explain how people sometimes act against either their own best interests, what would be good for them, or acting against their own conception of a just world. What would make for a just world? Okay, so she says ideology is that, whatever that is, whatever can explain how we can have a shared practical consciousness and explain how people sometimes act against their own self-interest and their own conception of justice. Okay. There are no uncontroversial examples of ideology, but you could maybe think of a few controversial examples for starters. So maybe you think of working class people who are anti-union or anti-wealth redistribution. They're opposed to institutions or social policies which would benefit them. Maybe you think historically of black supporters in the African diaspora or in the continental Africa of African colonialism, of the European colonization of Africa. Maybe you think of men who take on sorts of values that, according to which men should suppress the full range of emotions that they have, values which seemingly impoverish or deaden our emotional experiences. Maybe you think of women who are reflexively or unrealistically or unreasonably skeptical or critical of accusations of sexual assault or sexual harassment. Okay, so these are all examples of things that are a little close to home. Maybe a less close to home, and so possibly sort of easier to reason about example would be the example of female genital mutilation. Okay, this is not an easy thing to think about, and again, this is controversial. There's a lot that's been written about this stuff, but there are certain societies around the world where young women or girls have the external clitoris scarred surgically, often around the time of puberty. Okay, this can lead to all sorts of infection because the scarring isn't performed in a sterile environment. But its primary effect, seemingly, at least from an outside point of view, the main intended effect is to make penetrative sex more painful and to prevent women from achieving orgasm through stimulating the external clitoris. Okay. One of the things that's sort of remarkable, perhaps, about this practice is that it is largely carried out by and largely justified by women in societies in which this practice occurs. So you might think, well, this is, why would women engage in this practice, which is seemingly, or at least on its face, entirely devoted to hurting women? Okay, so these are all examples of shared ways of doing things, shared ways of life, which at least plausibly operate against the self-interest of or the conceptions of justice of the people who share these practices. And so Haslanger could say that's ideology, whatever that is, whatever is doing that work of giving us this shared practical consciousness and this tendency to work against our own self-interest and our own conception of justice, that's ideology. Okay, so then the question is, well, what's that? And long story short, she comes up with a theory that has a few sort of ingredients in it. But one sort of ingredient is the idea of a social practice that solves some sort of coordination problem. So, for example, we have a practice of sending kids to school, and this solves a problem of figuring out what to do with young children during the day when their parents are off at work and can't watch them. It also solves the problem of training people to be good, obedient, compliant workers when they're adults. It also solves the problem of accrediting people so that future employers don't have to do the work themselves of figuring out who's going to be who counts as a knowledgeable worker, or who knows what they need to know in order to work there. Okay, so that's an example of a practice solving a coordination problem, a problem that involves sort of getting a bunch of people to work together. Okay. There's the idea in Haslanger's theory of a social meaning that transforms our actions or imbues them imbues us with some sort of social role. Okay, so I am a teacher, and that would not be possible in the absence of some sort of shared practice of having schools and having some kinds of educational institutions. Your students, which would not be possible in the absence of these sorts of institutions. We have the practice of, for example, shaking hands. So you shake somebody's hand or give somebody a high five. Because of the way that we think and act, we've imbued, giving somebody a high five with a social meaning. Meaning is roughly congratulating somebody. Pink means girl, blue means boy. More controversially, but also more deleteriously, femininity might mean submissiveness. Masculinity might mean domination. Intelligence might mean removal from work with your hands. Okay, so these sorts of social meanings, these ways of sort of interpreting people's behavior or social signals and ways of understanding how sort of abstract social categories like femininity or masculinity or intelligence can be sort of manifested or realized. That's the concept of a social meaning, which plays a certain role in Haslanger's theory. She has the concept of a techne, a cultural techne, which is like a set of tools involving these social meanings and these practices, which give us some kind of behavioral repertoire, some set of things we can do, some sense of what our possibilities are. Okay. And Haslanger's understanding of an ideology ultimately is that an ideology is a cultural techne that arises from an unjust social structure. So it's a set of ways of doing things that is made up of or dependent on a network of social meanings and a set of practices that arises from or perhaps sustains or supports an unjust social structure. So what makes female genital mutilation, for example, ideological for Haslanger would be that it's a practice that's a part of or involved in a cultural techne that comes out of an unjust social structure, where this unjust social structure is roughly one of male domination or one where that prizes a certain sort of confining or unpleasant, perhaps, form of understanding of women's sexuality, or a type of monogamy or something like that. That it's an unjust way of enforcing monogamy. It's an unjust way of enforcing norms of female sexual purity, and so on. Okay. I think it's worth asking, if you wanted to apply Haslanger's concept of ideology, a cultural techne arising from an unjust social structure, how How would that look in the world of Tlön? Borges' own understanding of ideology there is belief first. But what if we took the practices first? what could it be possible to see idealism perhaps as arising out of the practices that make up Tlön society rather than the other way around? What would that look like? Okay. That's it. There you go. We'll pick